Richard Wolff is with us, Professor Richard Wolff. He of the democracyatwork.info website. His most recent book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, Profwollff, and democracyatwork.info. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you with us. I want to talk to you about the Republican tax plan and the consequences of last night's election. But before we get to that, I'd like to go back to the mass murder that we had a couple days ago. And I mean, actually, you know, we have one every single day. It's just that, you know, this one, he killed enough people that it pushed the threshold. You and your wife, Dr. Harriet Fraud, recently wrote a piece titled "America's Hypercapitalism Breeds the Lonely, Alienated Men Who Become Mass Killers." You want to riff about that?
Yeah, I'd like to, because I'm a little disappointed, to put it mildly, both in President Trump's being unable to go beyond the description of this event as evil, and much of the mainstream media's focus on whether or not guns are good. Putting that issue aside, there's precious little attempt to understand what is a glaring reality. No other country on the face of this earth has anything remotely like the regular mass killings, mostly of people unknown or unrelated to the shooter, since this is mostly done by guns, that we do. And any reasonable American ought to be wondering and asking the question, what is it about our society, unless you want to follow President Trump into thinking we are especially evil as a population? I don't take that seriously, so I don't go there. I want to know what's going on. What is it about the United States that takes the form of this kind of indiscriminate killing, whether it be from a hotel room, as in Las Vegas, or in a rural church, as happened in Texas a few days ago. I mean, it is so regular, as you pointed out, that it is long overdue to try to understand it. And what Dr. Fraud and I did was basically say, let's look at the economics, let's look at the psychology, and see whether there's a pattern here that can give us at least some initial clues as to what's going on. And basically what we found is that there were two phenomena, one economic and one, let's call it personal or psychological. Most of the people who have committed these crimes, when we've been able to track and figure out who they were and what might have motivated them, most of these people have suffered an economic reverse in the recent past. What I mean is they either got fired from their job, which often happened, or they got disconnected, and that's the word we like to use, because the work wasn't going well, their coworkers didn't like them, they got involved in some kind of difficulty at the job, and so kind of withdrew, made their money in some either illegal or under the table, or let's call it unusual. The guy in Las Vegas became virtually a professional gambler at the very hotels, one of which he did his deed from. So there was economic difficulty in the life of these people. And the second one was the psychological, that again, most of these people had been either rejected by a spouse or a close friend or a partner, or if they hadn't had that experience, they were the kind of person who never was able to make a firm, deep relationship with anybody, and so they were, again, disconnected. In the first instance, disconnected from the economy. In the second, disconnected from the emotional supports that every healthy life requires. End result, these are, as the newspapers sometimes like to say, loners. But they're not loners by some throw of the genetic dice. They are victims in this society of an economic system that does not care for millions of people, either by giving them unemployment or by giving them backbreaking jobs at very low pay. I won't go into all of that. Your listeners, I'm sure, know it. And likewise, they are victims of a society whose isolation, as we all stare into our cell phones, our smartphones, watch the TV, live a life disconnected more and more from close relationships. What we're seeing is a society that is deeply lonely, deeply alienated, disconnected, and if you add that kind of pressure to people who may have all kinds of personal problems, you have an extremely dangerous mix here. But to focus on the personal problems, which we all have more or less, as if they are the explanation, is really a rather dishonest way of pretending that there aren't larger social, economic, and psychological factors which we could do something about, and we ought to talk about in order to do something so we don't have these horrific results, which, again, no other modern society has.
Right. The other problem, I mean, this is sort of like you've identified all the gunpowder laying on the ground. The spark that sets it off is, in my opinion, is that the United States has 44% of the world's guns, and we're only 5% of the world's population. So when somebody encounters the crises that you're talking about in any other country, they seek counseling, which, by the way, is typically paid for by the government as part of their national health care system, or they seek out friends or whatever. But here in the United States, they just grab a gun.
Right, and you know, there's an interesting parallel statistic. We're 5% roughly of the world's population, and we consume 60% of what we call psychotropic drugs. That is, one kind or another of a tranquilizer or a mood enhancer. In other words, we live in an economic system where it is extremely profitable not only to sell us guns as a magical way to overcome our loneliness and isolation, but likewise pharmacology sending us endless pills. You know, we're the only country that allows company to the public advertising of psychological drugs. In other countries, you can only advertise to doctors. You can't advertise directly to the public since they can't possibly understand the chemistry and so forth behind it. You see a system that is not only making people very disconnected economically and psychologically, but is also intent on profiting from whether it's guns or psychological drugs, and the end result is, yes, people get depressed. Of course they do. And that's a serious problem in our country. But likewise, when they get depressed, as you put it, they look for solutions that are more driven by the profit of companies making things than it is by a notion of wanting to help people that are in psychological and economic difficulty. If not for the decency of doing it, then at least to prevent the kind of wholesale random killing that we are becoming famous around the world for.
Yeah, and it seems to be happening more and more and more.
Yes.
Sean, how are we doing on time? We're hitting the break. Okay, I'm sorry. Professor Wolff, we'll have to have our conversation about the election another time. I'm sorry, but thanks so much for dropping by today.
My pleasure, and take care, Tom.
Thank you. Great talking with you. Professor Richard Wolff, you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, W-O-L-F-F, and the website, of course, is democracywork.info.